Thank you, Professor Abbas, and thank you for that reminder that, for the last 70 years, we keep talking about security, and everything we've done has made us less secure, and exacerbating anti-American sentiment throughout the world, not just in the region. So we need to review what the security measures are and get rid of geopolitical biases that actually compromise our security as citizens of the United States. Next, we have a person that I have a tough time keeping up with. She is in every sector of work, whether it's providing scholarships for rising stars in public policy and media, teaching, moderating panels. She moderated the panel before. Now she's a speaker, just to prove the point. She is an associate professor of political science at Long Island University, and her topic is U.S. foreign policy and authoritarianism, implications for democracy in the Muslim world. Please welcome Professor Dalia Fahmy.
Thank you so much. It's tough to follow these two speakers. I actually want to problematize the title of the panel, the U.S. international responses to democratic backsliding in the Muslim world, because it assumes that there's a causal arrow here, that there is a democratic backsliding that begins in the Muslim world. And I actually want to problematize that and talk about the global resurgence of authoritarianism and the democratic backsliding everywhere, and ask ourselves, why do we see it as, for example, a fundamentally Middle Eastern issue and not something bit more global? Yes, I'm going to pay particular attention to the Middle East today, where a region where authoritarian governance is deeply entrenched and is continuously evolving. And I want to talk about the manifestations of this evolution. But authoritarianism is on the rise. According to Freedom House, 2024 marked the 18th consecutive year of global democratic decline. The regression is not uniform. Yes, it has different dynamics in different regions of the world, but the global trend is undeniable. And I think in building on the last two speakers, looking at 20 years of war in Afghanistan, where did that lead us? The Taliban are back. We talk about Iraq as an oops, right? The former president said, Iraq, oops, right? With that, the global implications of what U.S. foreign policy has done, and Gaza being a fulcrum of how we will forever think about international human rights, international law, and how we talk about liberalism and democracy. Perhaps it's redefining how we should see ourselves. So how do we understand authoritarianism? Authoritarian regimes are characterized by the concentration of power in the hands of a narrow elite, often with limited political pluralism, constrained civil liberties, and a weak rule of law, something that we're being tested with here in the United States, where the last bastion is this rule of law. It's the only thing that we have left, basically. These regimes might be military juntas, absolute monarchies, or presidential autocracies, but they are not static. Today's authoritarian leaders do have this facade of democracy, elections, parliaments, constitutions, while hollowing out institutions from within. What we're seeing globally is a form of authoritarian resilience, where regimes are learning from one another, adapting, or even cooperating on how to resist democratization. So what's fueling this rise? This idea of a disillusionment with democracy. Although earlier today I did talk about how there's 78% of those of civilians in the Middle East that were polled say they do support democracy, good governance, transparency, and elections, there's this also a narrative rising globally about a disillusion with democracy, especially in its perceived inefficiency and failure to deliver, right? Which is what we're hearing here in the United States, for example. The second are the technological tools of surveillance and control, which make repression much more sophisticated and much more globalized. Again, where are these companies from? Where do they sit? And who's buying the technology? I'll discuss shortly. Geopolitical realignment, the role of the United States and how it's waning. And we see a rise in Russia, China, Iran, and others offering global alternatives. And economic volatility, exacerbated by war, climate change, and post-pandemic instability. Now, how do these manifest particularly in the Middle East? While the Middle East is often regarded as the bastion of authoritarianism, The region has more monarchies and fewer democracies, but this generalization actually obscures a couple of important nuances. First is that in the Gulf, authoritarianism is, yes, monarchical, but these regimes have a traditional blend of legitimacy with oil wealth and coercive capacity. Let's take Saudi Arabia under MBS. Since 2017, he's consolidated power under the banner of reform, modernizing the economy, loosening social restrictions. But alongside Vision 2030, modernization has come with brutal repression. For example, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, mass executions, the silencing of dissent. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, especially those moderates like Sheikh Salman Auda, who still is in prison. Whose son is the next speaker, by the way. Sorry. This is modernized authoritarianism. Tech-savvy, reformist in rhetoric, yet uncompromising in control. Next, military and presidential autocracies. Egypt is another example. Since the 2013 military coup that removed elected President Mohamed Morsi, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has presided over one of the most repressive regimes in Egyptian history. We've been saying 60,000 political prisoners since 2013. We know today that there are actually more than that. Tens of thousands of political prisoners languishing in jail. Media is highly controlled. Actually, about 100% of the media is owned by the security apparatus, and civil society has been attempted to be decimated. Illiberal hybrid regimes and de-democratization. Tunisia was once heralded as the Arab Spring's only success story, but in 2021, President Kais Saied dissolved the parliament, assumed extraordinary powers, and rewrote the constitution. And so what we witness is a democratic backslide into personalized autocracy, not unlike trends we're seeing throughout the rest of the world, where it's personalized around a personality. And what about the new tools of control? Across the region, authoritarian regimes are increasingly using digital surveillance, cybercrime laws, and artificial intelligence to monitor dissent, both online and offline. Israel's Pegasus spyware, for example, has been used by multiple governments in the Middle East to target journalists and activists. What's common with all these regimes is that it's a strategic emphasis on stability, security, and national unity to justify the oppression. Now, these regimes often point to the failure of democratic transitions like Libya and Iraq and argue that only a strong man can protect against those failures. And what about the regional and global dimensions? The Middle East's authoritarian turn is not happening in a vacuum. It's embedded in global dynamics. Authoritarian regimes are learning and supporting one another. For example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia backed Sisi's coup in Egypt and have supported other illiberal actors in the region, often framed as a fight against political Islam. But it's also a battle against democratic norms. What about the authoritarian international? Russia and China have both increased their footprint in the region. For example, Russia's military support for Assad when he was in power helped him stay in power. What about China, meanwhile, offering a different model for economic development without political liberalization? That's investing heavily in Gulf economies. And as multipolarity weakens the leverage of Western democracies, it emboldens local authoritarians, seeing that they have alternatives. And finally, what about the role of the United States and how it's contributed to its authoritarian persistence throughout the region through selective engagement? While Washington historically has supposedly promoted democracy rhetorically, it supports autocratic regimes for so-called strategic interests. I remember when President Obama gave his final address to the UN General Assembly, he said that the U.S., when this is again post-Arab Spring, the U.S. would put the full power of the military behind counterterrorism operations, the security of the State of Israel, Sinai and flyover rights, and access to the Suez Canal. But when it comes to things like democratization and human rights, these are things that will enter into discussion. And so it's that big distinction that happened right after the Arab Spring that says, wait, perhaps this notion of selective engagement is not really about real democratization. And so what are the implications of U.S. foreign policy then? Well, we're in a strategic dilemma. We talk about realpolitik versus normative values, but is it really about normative values? What about the declining leverage of the U.S. in the region and the rise of China and Russia? Authoritarian regimes have alternatives. And what about weaponized stability? Stability is also often seen as fragile and repressive. For years, I think my first CSID conference was in 2005 when I was a grad student. And since back then, I think every time I spoke, I say the same thing, that we have in the United States seen democracy and authoritarianism as two sides of the same coin. We would rather the so-called stability of authoritarian repression rather than the uncertainty of democracy. But what we do know since the Arab Spring is that the uncertainty of democracy is actually how you get to long-term stability, rather than repression that actually leads to increasing instability. And yet we refuse to update our repertoire when it comes to that. What about credibility and soft power? What about the challenge of democratic solidarity? What we saw happen a couple of weeks ago when President Trump visited the Gulf has significant influence on, I think, the future of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, because it actually solidified transactional diplomacy and a regional realignment and its recalibration to that we are not even beyond the kind of conversation of norms and democracy versus realpolitik. Rather, there is a shift towards transactional diplomacy. In this recent visit, President Trump emphasized economic partnerships, not necessarily security partnerships. He talked about arms deals, energy investment, infrastructure projects that are not just to benefit, I think, the United States, but more so himself and his family. The approach underscores a strategic move away from U.S. advocacy for democratic reform, moving towards this pragmatic insistence on mutual economic gain. What about re-engagement with Iran and other Gulf states and how they caution this move? What about the controversial Gaza proposal and the regional response? What about the U.S. Houthi ceasefire and Israel? What about ethical concerns over business dealings and what they blur in terms of lines between personal and national interests? Do we even talk about national interests in the way we did historically about long-term interests? And so President Trump's recent trip signifies a strategic pivot in U.S. Middle East policy characterized by a focus on those transactional relationships. While some see this as pragmatic, it's a departure from traditional advocacy for democratic reforms. We actually didn't hear the word democracy used. We didn't hear the term international human rights. And so to conclude, authoritarianism is resurging globally, but especially so in the Middle East, where regimes have adapted to new realities, employing technology, manipulating elections, and coordinating with like-minded allies. For U.S. foreign policy, this represents an interesting challenge. How do you balance this new understanding of pragmatic transactional interests with how we understand democratic values and how we used to historically talk about democratic values and democracy being the gateway to long-term stability? Is democratic peace theory dead? Well, there's no easy answer. But what's clear is that ignoring authoritarianism in the name of stability is not sustainable. And perhaps we need to look at the future talking about reality as it is, not between democracy and authoritarianism, but between flexible resilience and brutal control, between inclusive governance and elite domination. And what does it mean to actually have civil society engagement and principled leadership? In the Middle East, or in this regard, will remain a key battleground in the struggle of how we define long-term stability for the United States. Thank you.